Welcome to Mayor Brown's Tech Talks podcast. Each podcast is designed to provide insights on legal issues relating to technology transactions and keep you up to date on the latest trends in data, digital, outsourcing, and software by drawing on the perspectives of practitioners who have executed technology transactions around the world. You can subscribe to this series on all major podcasting platforms. We hope you enjoy the program.
My name is Julian Dibbell, and I'm delighted to serve as moderator. I am a senior associate in Mayor Brown's Chicago office, focusing my practice on technology transactions. I'm pleased to introduce my fellow presenters. Joining me today are my colleagues and technology transaction leaders, Dan Masur, Brad Peterson, and Linda Rhodes. For more than 20 years, Dan, Brad, and Linda have represented national and international clients in a broad range of onshore, nearshore, and offshore information technology and business process sourcing transactions. In the past few months, each of them has worked extensively with clients in work from home and other arrangements to help clients adapt those deals in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. What they're seeing now is that our clients are working to make a successful return to working from shared facilities and to emerge from the pandemic stronger and more resilient. In this podcast, Dan, Brad, and Linda are going to discuss steps to consider for outsourcing and other technology-based services contracts as we emerge from the pandemic. Linda, let me start with you. Could you describe what companies should be thinking about as their service providers emerge from a regime where their employees have been working from home and now start to return to working from shared facilities?
Yes, thank you, Julian. You may recall at the front end of the pandemic, many suppliers approached their customers asking for excuse from their inability to perform certain services in accordance with contract requirements, arising out of the pandemic and resulting government mandates on social distancing and stay-at-home requirements. Much of the focus at that time was around whether or not the pandemic constituted a force majeure event under the contract terms to determine what extent the existing contract terms excuse supplier non-performance. However, regardless of whether or not the pandemic gave rise to a force majeure event under a particular contract, customers worked with their suppliers to address the realities of the pandemic. In particular, the parties considered how to address contract requirements that suppliers work from agreed facilities. Many of our clients negotiated with suppliers on what we called work-from-home waivers, which basically permitted supplier personnel to perform services from their home. They also negotiated waivers for certain performance obligations or negotiated waivers covering both or similar items. Preparing for a return to the work environment is not a simple matter. Businesses are planning to implement return to work in a phased manner. No one is looking for a quick return to the old normal, or quite frankly, even a return to the old normal at all, which we'll discuss further. But in terms of planning for getting back to the work environment, it will be important to focus on what your contract says, as is typically the case in technology transactions. So, for example, if the pandemic constituted a force majeure event under the contract at the front end, it's helpful to refer back to your contract to determine at what point does that force majeure event end as drafted in your contract. Similarly, many contracts that have force majeure provisions in them and where those force majeure provisions apply to this particular pandemic, at the same time require that suppliers use commercially reasonable efforts to perform their obligations, notwithstanding the force majeure event, and that the suppliers work to quickly restore the original services. So as governments ease their quarantines and stay-at-home mandates, the question becomes what constitutes commercially reasonable efforts. So at the beginning of the pandemic, when you had everybody in the workforce working from a home environment, there were certain types of workarounds that had to be put in place. as those supplier personnel start to return to the work environment, you might not need the same accommodations that you had at the front end. So thinking through, again, what now constitutes using commercially reasonable efforts may look quite different than what constituted using commercially reasonable efforts 10 weeks ago when the pandemic first hit.
Okay. So as we're returning to something resembling normal, just pay careful attention to those clauses in the contract that govern that transition back out of the exceptional state of force majeure or other exceptional events, right? So that said, though, even though we are returning to something like normal, as you mentioned, it's not going to be the same normal that we were living under before. So even though the stay-at-home orders and mandates are easing up, there's going to need to be some changes in the work environment. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. You can see just by watching the news and the businesses that have been open because they're essential, or businesses as they start to open, or even going to the grocery store, you'll see blue tape that helps people in maintaining social distancing. People are wearing masks when they're in a place where other patrons are also. So you're going to have to look to similar ways to address the pandemic issues when you get back to the normal work environment. And so you have to think about, how are we going to social distance? Are we going to have conferences? If we have them, how do we set them up so that everybody's socially distant from the other person? How many people are going to be in the office at any one time? So how people act within the workplace will need to change. And so many sourcing contracts require that suppliers at or maybe all times work from a customer environment. You could have certain supplier personnel who are dedicated to a customer environment. And typically, a sourcing contract will require that supplier personnel comply with the customer's workplace rules when they're located at the customer's premises. So what customers need to do is now think about, how do those rules need to change in this new environment, and how do we make sure that they're passed through to your supplier so that when they're on their facilities, you maintain the necessary social distancing and the like. Also, as I mentioned earlier, many customers executed upfront waivers for this with their suppliers. And as the parties start to get back to work, they need to start planning for how to scale back on the accommodations provided in those waivers. In particular, it will be important to think through the timing and the priority of the return of supplier workforce to shared facilities. Who's coming in first? What's the priority? How do you ramp up? And your contract terms may already be helpful in this respect. Many contract terms have rights of customers, for example, to have a say in who are key personnel, and the commitments of the key personnel may be greater than other supplier personnel. There may be other contract terms that require that the supplier treats a particular customer at least as favorably as they treat their other similarly situated customers. So, as is always the case, you want to ground yourself in what you actually have in your contract and then think through how we're going to apply that to the current situation. And then finally, Dan and Brad will discuss this further, but businesses are really going to have to prepare for work from home as a standard process. In particular, looking at data security requirements and making sure that data security will be in place as personnel work from home, and also to consider technology requirements to ensure that performance standards are met even while personnel are working from a home environment, which is typically not as sophisticated as a work environment.
Okay, so starting to look forward to the next emergence of a similar situation is going to be a key part of the transition. Dan, let me ask you, what are some other things that companies should be doing in order to emerge from this pandemic stronger and more prepared for similar challenges?
Thanks, Julian. In the wake of the pandemic, we expect our clients to re-examine their corporate sourcing strategies for outsourcing and other technology-based services looking to reduce the risk and impact associated with pandemics and other such global challenges. The pandemic has been, to coin a phrase, a wake-up call, and we expect to see a new emphasis on resilience and mitigating large-scale risks. Sourcing strategy and supply chain management have, in our view, vaulted from being back-office functions to C-suite level concerns.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. First, clients may consider increasing the focus on supplier resiliency and redundancy, including, for example, through enhanced vendor risk management programs, redundant sources of supply, and reimagined technical architectures. Second, they may look to geographically realign their service delivery model to reduce the risks associated with individual countries or regions, perhaps by moving certain critical functions either to in-country solutions or in-region suppliers. Third, clients may consider building work-from-home strategies and capabilities into the day-to-day service delivery model so that security and other challenges can be addressed in advance and the organizational disruption associated with future events can be minimized. Fourth, we expect a focus on updating business continuity and disaster recovery planning to address contingencies such as global pandemics that are not covered by the traditional focus on relocating services to backup facilities at different locations. Fifth, clients may look to leverage artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, software as a service, and other digital technologies to decrease reliance on human resources, potentially creating end-to-end digital capabilities that can continue operations when humans are unavailable. Finally, we expect clients to consider selectively insourcing critical functions as a means to increase control and decrease risk that critical resources are diverted by suppliers to other clients.
Dan, that's a great set of considerations for any type of major business. What about businesses in regulated industries? Are there any additional considerations for them?
That's an excellent point, Julian. Financial institutions and other regulated companies will have to be particularly diligent in dealing with what we expect to be great pressure both on the regulators and by the regulators on our clients to reduce the risk of future pandemics and other such challenges. Regulated companies must be prepared to track and respond to regulatory concerns and regulatory proposals, both to comply and to help shape the regulatory response. As regulatory responses appear, regulated companies will have to bring their existing sourcing strategies and critical vendor relationships into compliance.
Brad, turning to you, can you describe how companies can build the lessons learned from this pandemic into contracting strategies going forward?
Julian, great question. We anticipate that the new strategic plans that Dan described will change how businesses contract for information technology and business process services. Businesses will seek to be ready for the next pandemic-like event and to adjust for the next normal with social distancing restrictions that greatly reduce the capacity of buildings and transportation networks. So, for example, we expect the following as to contracting strategies. First, a move away from contracting for excusing performance based on force majeure events to contracting for a services offering with protections against low probability events and against circumstances that could have a material adverse effect on performance. Second, as Dan noticed, businesses will focus increasingly on business continuity and disaster recovery, or BCDR. The pandemic revealed the flaw in the BCDR provisions that are so common in the ITO and BPO contracts that we have today. Those contracts at best suggest that BCDR consists of there being seats in another building somewhere, which of course is no help at all if people can't go to buildings at all. The pandemic has also exposed, even in those conditions, the lack of stress testing by customers. What we expect to see is what we saw after the financial crisis 10 years ago, when some of the weaknesses in our financial infrastructure became apparent. And we expect to see specific, effective, auditable, and enforceable provisions. And like Dan said, we expect to see regulators making sure that that's true. Third, we expect to see contracting teams engaging in more scenario-based financial analysis of sourcing transactions. What that means is considering the low likelihood but high impact contingencies. Traditionally, financial modeling looks at a scenario where all goes as planned. You have a base case for the next 3, 5, 7 years, and then you look at the supplier's pricing against that. In the future, if there's perhaps an estimated 5% chance that there will be a pandemic-like event during the term, financial modeling will consider that scenario with a 5% weight. And that's critical for lawyers because we are, at our core, services supply chain risk management professionals. And we will increase the value that we provide as they begin to put financial prices around those protections against the 5% kind of scenarios or the 1% kind of scenarios.
That's very interesting. In the near term, what specific impacts on contract provisions do you see related to the work environment?
Well, every contract is different, of course, but most of the ITO and BPO contracts that we've seen have been based on the assumption that the work will be performed from offices. As Linda noted, we need to consider work from home as a standard process. So let's take a few examples of how this will impact contracts specifically. First, data security. Traditionally, outsourcing data security standards have been based on clean rooms and other physical security measures. For the new normal, data security provisions must be based not on physical security, but logical security. We're seeing multi-factor authentication, access controls, electronic surveillance by supervisors, virtual private networks, virtual desktop environments, and other logical security measures being reasonable ways to approximate what was achieved with prior physical security measures. Second, service delivery. There was an entirely reasonable assumption, pre-work from home, that a supplier could assure that its workforce was productive simply by having supervisors watching the people working. Thus, it was reasonable to bill based on full-time effort, or FTEs. There's a question about that. When people are home with their children, customers will expect some sort of metrics closer to indicating value. And that might be virtual supervision. We might look at transactions processed, keystrokes, active periods of typing, watching eyeballs, something of that sort. Or it might be a change in the methods of service delivery. Even in cases where pricing and cost is relatively equal, customers may prefer an end-to-end digital transformation because it significantly lowers the risk of the human-based delivery models. Third, there will be changes on governance and working together. For 20 years, Linda, Dan, and I have worked on contracts where customers showed a strong desire and often insisted in contract provisions that there be live meetings for critical governance, planning, and other joint development activities. In the new normal, we likely will see companies, if anything, avoiding live meetings, and thus rethinking any provisions requiring or in some cases even allowing supplier personnel to work in customer facilities or meet in person with customer personnel. Fourth example, on technology. Generally, customers use approval of a physical facility as a proxy for review of all the technology used to provide the services. So in approving a facility, they check how good are the internet connections, how reliable is the power, is there backup power, how good are the handsets in the buildings, how good are the the server infrastructure for delivering high speed and high quality services. Customers in the work from home waivers, of course, could not ask for that level of scrutiny with respect to work from home arrangements. But we expect customers, of course, to be expecting alternative contractual assurances as to work from home, as to the home-based technology, and that work will be able to continue to get done despite difficult weather, power outages, internet outages, and so forth.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a lot of changes to take into account. Are there any other changes companies want to consider?
Julian, there are going to be a welter of changes to consider. As a core principle, we expect BPO and ITO customers to increase attention to the contractual commitments as to how services will be performed to allow customers to better manage the risks in their services supply chains. Many customers are, as Dan mentioned, seeing supply chain resiliency and redundancy and reliability as C-suite issues in a way that they weren't 2 or 3 years ago. That's true across the economy. That's true for the goods supply chain, the data supply chain, and the services supply chain. We expect that to require new contractual supply arrangements with more redundancy, more onshore delivery, and more thoughtful contract provisions. There are also situations where customers will be making major business changes. In some industries, volumes are decreased and they are forever decreased. And so those will go beyond renegotiation bands and require a rethinking of how the deals are structured. And all that is going to mean that this is a time for rapid innovation in ITO and BPO, not just in technology and geography, but in contract terms across the board. It's a great opportunity for all of us who work in this area to deliver more value to our clients as we move toward a more resilient, secure, and reliable collection of critical services arrangements. So, Julian, to summarize, all of the changes that Linda, Dan, and I have talked about today, the smart return to shared facilities, an emphasis on strategic planning, and improved contract terms, can help businesses survive the COVID-19 crisis and survive in the next normal. Just as the financial crisis led to a more resilient and safe financial system, the COVID-19 crisis can lead to a more resilient global services supply chain. We hope that this legal update helps all of our clients to seize this opportunity to emerge out of this crisis stronger and more resilient.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Dan and Linda, for the thoughtful analysis and valuable perspective. For those listening, if you have any questions regarding this podcast, please send them along to techtransactions@mayorbrown.com. Your question will be forwarded to the appropriate presenter for a response. Thanks again. This concludes our podcast. I hope you found it useful.
We hope you enjoyed this program. You can subscribe on all major podcasting platforms. To learn about other Mayor Brown audio programming, visit mayorbrown.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening.